Welcome to We Can Be. I'm Chris DeCardy, and today's guest is going to inspire you. I know she did so to me when I saw her speak last fall, when she was honored with the 2023 Heinz Award for the Environment at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History in Pittsburgh. We're excited to welcome Colette Pichon Battle. She grew up with deep family and community roots in her hometown along the Gulf Coast in Louisiana, became a successful attorney, practicing corporate law in Washington, D.C., and then one day she took on another role, environmental activist. She's the founder of Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy and now holds the role of Vision and Initiatives Partner for Taproot Earth. Taproot seeds global campaigns and self-governing formations that address the root cause of the climate crisis, reimagine sustainable solutions, and shift the structures necessary to create a more sustainable world. Through that work, she is igniting the climate justice movement, not only in southern Louisiana, but through Appalachia and now across the globe. Colette Pichon Battle, welcome to We Can Be.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I want to begin with something that I'm sure has to have you going through a bunch of emotions right now, which is we're talking today, and we're not anywhere near the recovery phase from the impact of Hurricane Helene. We're still in the response phase. Days later, there are people unaccounted for, people without water. Devastation is unimaginable for regions of the country, especially in, I think, Western North Carolina as an example, that have never seen anything like this. Given your career, given your leadership, given your passion, given that it's 2 decades now, just about since Hurricane Katrina, how are you and what does this bring up for you?
Yeah, thank you for not just that question, but for acknowledging what's going on. I think, an important piece of the climate work is that folks start to acknowledge and tell the truth and connect the dots around extreme weather events and a changing climate reality. I'll tell you the truth, the summer is always a very intense time, not just for me. Several folks on the Taproot Earth staff are hurricane survivors, and you can feel the anxiety and the anticipation. There are daily prayers that the storms don't come, and when they do, you hope that they won't be as bad as the worst you've ever experienced. The surface temperatures of the Gulf of Mexico have been over 90 degrees Fahrenheit this year. We're used to looking at hurricanes coming from the Atlantic. These last 2 formed in the Gulf, and they're going fast and they're going big. Normally, the hurricanes stop their power as they hit land, but there's still tropical storms now going all the way up to North Carolina, going all the way up to Philadelphia. It is an emotional moment because you know that people are not going to pay attention to this issue in a deep and real way until you're hit by it. But it is also a moment where I am reassured that the work that I've committed my life to is the right work. It's sad. You know what people are going through. You know what they need. You know what it is to be without electricity, without water, without the ability for people to get to you. So you have to rely on yourself and your neighbors. It's scary, but you do get to see the best of people in those first few days, believe it or not. The worst of people come out in the next few days, but the first few days, you see the best of humans. You see the best of humanity. The race lines, the gender lines, those things get erased and we become humans with each other again.
The initial response brings out the best in people, Indeed. And then something happens. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit from the networks of people you work with, from the experience of being hit in that very deep and real way, how to take that best of humanity and what have you seen as being crucial or lessons learned to keep it going forward?
So I live just outside of New Orleans in the bayou area, and there's the city, there are these surrounding bayous, there's swamp and marsh all around, and inside of those places are long-standing communities that most people don't even know about. New Orleans was a major port city before the United States was even in existence. And so the numbers of longstanding communities just around that area are, would blow your mind. There's, of course, a really beautiful Black population in that area, but there's also a huge indigenous population. The work they do when we see a storm or recovery, the way they work together, the way they move in and out of rural areas would amaze you. They know the land, they know the waterways. The street gets flooded or you can't get through. There are other ways to get through: the bayous, the canals. So you watch how folks who know this land can maneuver to get people to safety. There's a longstanding Vietnamese community. The Gulf South has got the largest population of Vietnamese outside of Vietnam. Anyway, these communities moved together after Katrina. In New Orleans East, it was amazing. They moved out together, they moved back in together. And the lesson there was large amounts of people moving back home together required the city to get the lights back on, to get the infrastructure back running. What happens when we move together? What happens when we move with people who know the land? A major lesson for me. I think the biggest thing is just seeing Southern hospitality or Southern culture really come into play, especially in times of disaster, because the truth is, when we're at our best selves, we're really nice people. We're kind of fun and funny and just come on in and get what you need and let me check on you, because that's what we do. And community has been a major part of Southern culture for all my life. And community, while it seems probably so simple, is what I believe one of the answers to the climate crisis is. Part of what we are struggling with is our disconnection from each other, being extracted from our cultural heritage. You've got to know how to build community. That's what the South really brings into some of these moments. It's not what you would always think.
You have mentioned before about respect and about sacredness of place, and it means so much to you. But it's not like you grew up there and stayed there. You went away. So talk about that journey. Where did you go and what were you doing? What made you leave?
So I come from a working class family. My mother is a teacher. She was a teacher for almost 40 years, and education was really important. But we didn't have any money. You learn very early on, if you want to go to school, you're going to have to get a scholarship. I just remember looking for schools very far away from the South. I didn't even really care what the schools were. I just wanted to be far away from the South. And so I won a few writing contests while I was in high school, and I ended up getting a scholarship offer from Kenyon College, which was known for its writing program and its English program. So I went away from Louisiana to Ohio, the furthest I'd ever gone, and was really taken into an academic institution that wanted to see me grow and get stronger and get better, but also offered me several doorways into the world. So I was an international studies, world religion major, and to pursue that major, you had to live abroad. You have to go learn a language, you've got to see another culture, you've got to be in a space. So I went to Morocco for my semester abroad and studied Arabic, learned how to write classical Arabic, and spoke French and took my classes and saw another culture. And then when I graduated from Kenyon, I got a Watson Fellowship and went back to Morocco, Mauritania, and Senegal, and lived in the north and the western parts of the continent. Beautiful experience. And it was the first place where I learned about human rights and wanting to do human rights and something to do with the ecology. I want to be with the land and I want to be with human rights. All of the lessons I learned would show back up in the aftermath of Katrina. When I came home from living in Africa, I went to law school in Baton Rouge and finished my law degree and really thought I was going to work in the federal government or, work in DC, I wasn't sure exactly where I was going to go, but I knew it was going to be up and out in the world. And that's when Katrina hit.
Buildings have collapsed. At least one levee has broken in New Orleans, leading to some localized flooding.
Up through the manhole covers, I can see the water just bubbling up through those manhole covers now, just so much water.
Winds continue to pound us out of the east, southeast now, certainly over 100 miles an hour.
Emergency managers here say as many as 750,000 people in southeast Louisiana are still without power. It could take up to a month to restore all of that power.
We are gonna die out here if they do not see somebody out here right now.
We need to feed our babies. We need to give our babies some water.
Somebody rescue us.
It's hard to know when people will be able to come back. Will it be days or weeks or months? And what is it they'll come back to?
You talk about this journey, deep connection to place, to people, community that you saw growing up. Why Katrina and why back? What did you see your role as, and what were you bringing?
I didn't see or think anything. I just knew I had to go home. You know, it's the way you react to a fire and your mom is in the building or your baby is in danger. You go to them. My community was destroyed. All of the communities across the region were destroyed. And I had no idea what I was going to do or contribute. I just knew I needed to get back home. And, you know, those first few days, you're saying to yourself, what can a lawyer do? What can a lawyer do? We need walls and roofs and trees cut. And, you know, what can a lawyer do? So I didn't know what I was going to do. I ended up figuring out how to be of help. But it was mostly because my community, when they heard I was home, the first things that people were bringing when they heard I was home was paper, and paperwork. Red Cross, FEMA, they've got lots of paper, big legal words. It turns out somebody needed to read that stuff. It would impact your home. It would impact your income. It would impact your relationship with the federal government. So my job very quickly began to be one of an interpreter.
So you said at some point about this journey back that until this point, I didn't understand how much injustice is located in the middle of a disaster. What was happening to you as you're helping people navigate this bureaucracy for what they have as basic human needs?
The first thing I saw was the state of the education level in Louisiana. You know, I had heard all of the critiques of the education system in the South, but I'd never really seen the real life impacts on people not having a good education. So the first thing I saw was the injustice of a really poor education system in the South. That was evident across the board. And then to go into other communities that had even less access to education, especially immigrant communities, first generation communities, you know, it was really interesting to see. But when you get to the paperwork, even when the paperwork went successfully through the process, which was not always the first round of things, when you would make it through, there were always loopholes or kinks or something that didn't work for Black people or something that didn't work for Indigenous people or something that didn't work for first generation folks or something that didn't work for gender nonconforming folks. And so you would see that the paperwork, the way it was built out, number one, by the federal government, assumed that all people all around the United States were exactly the same. Legally, I understand that starting point, but practically in a recovery, that's just not the case. You know, Louisiana had one of the largest populations of people who never left the state. They're generational homes that a lot of people in America don't understand because the assumption in America is that you're going to have, you know, you're going to be heterosexual, you're going to have 2.5 kids, you're going to get your degree, and you're going to move somewhere that you choose to be. And Louisiana in particular was one of those places where none of that was true. And if you lived in another house, it was right next door to your parents or your grandparents, or you lived in the same house. None of that paperwork took any of that into consideration. And in fact, put thousands of people at odds with the federal government for fraudulent filings because the federal government never understood that two households could be in one house. And legally, when you send that paperwork in, there are repercussions from the federal government, a whole lawsuit against FEMA, specifically around what they called recoupment. And you could just see it play out because who else is living in these generational homes? There were legal cases that showed even in the recovery, your recovery was based on the value of your home. But redlining and the history of redlining necessarily makes homes in Black neighborhoods, even though they have the same square footage, worth less than homes in white neighborhoods. And so when you went to Home Depot, the Black person went with a check for $5,000 less than a white person went with, even though they had the same square footage to fix, to build up.
And the plywood cost the same.
The plywood cost exactly the same. And none of this was taken into consideration. You know, there were laws being changed about who could come back into different parishes. A parish next door to us in St. Bernard said you could only come back if you, had people who lived there before, and trying to keep it white, trying to keep that parish white so that people who were fleeing and leaving and spreading out didn't go there. It was the inadequacies and the way we think about government response to its own citizens, its own people, the ways that power is used to keep people out or keep people protected. And then you start putting those things together and you realize the system is broken.
The tourists have returned. But nearly 100,000 African American New Orleanians gone. In the lower Ninth Ward, where the most damage was done. Almost entirely African American before the storm, only 37% of its pre-Katrina residents have returned.
People talk about Katrina being an equal opportunity storm, but if you were a black homeowner, you were more than 3 times more likely to have lost your home in the flooding than if you were a white homeowner. And just like it wasn't an equal opportunity storm, it has not been an equal opportunity recovery.
You've used a term called climate gentrification. I wonder if you could describe what that is and how you came to use that term.
The interesting thing is that I was practicing corporate immigration law before Katrina. And so I had this very strange knowledge of the movement of people, mostly across our U.S. borders, but a little bit around other international borders. And so I had a particular eye around migration and who was forced out of the region, who was brought in to the region, and that was for the acute disaster. The same shifts happen with the long-term disaster. So like sea level rise is happening very slowly. It is, in fact, moving people all around, but you don't think about it because it's happening, year by year. But you see a very fast movement of people in the aftermath of an acute disaster like a hurricane. With Katrina in particular, it was really shocking. I returned to a region that was devoid of its people. The very first months, we were just locating each other. And then you hear the stories. Some people were forced out of their homes by gunpoint. Who were those people? Those people were living in public housing in New Orleans. The people living uptown New Orleans in the mansions were not forced out of their homes by gunpoint. In fact, they were allowed to remain and actually pull in private security to protect their property. There was a movement that started to happen right around year 2 where people started coming, a lot of academics wanting to study. They're bringing their families, folks wanting to come because New Orleans needs me. I remember Teach for America, a federal program, pushed lots of young teachers into the region. Meanwhile, nobody was helping any of the folks who were forced out to get back home. And then you start to see people coming in from the Northeast and the West Coast who see the prices of a house in Louisiana as something that's very easy. So the numbers started coming back, but they weren't our people. And we're still about 100,000 down in New Orleans in particular from the population pre-Katrina. The gentrification has now brought in a whole new group of people who are not only whiter from the Northeast and the West Coast, so no real connection to the culture outside of consuming the culture, right? They're not bearers of it. They're not accountable to holding it, but they consume it. So you watch a lot of our traditions be commodified because the new range of people don't know that the second line is a sacred dance that you do to honor life. They do it for their birthday party. The gentrification that you see slowly coming after a disaster usually has to do with who has privilege, who has the privilege to move around, who's got the money. But what we're seeing across the board is the movement of people either in acute disaster or slowly. And I think this is going to be one of the largest issues that our country's that the world is going to have to deal with, the movement of people as weather gets more extreme, as temperatures get warmer, as storms get harder and move faster. The movement of people is not something this country is good at. And this is what's coming up next.
This long history that you talked about in 2 ways. One is the people that end up being displaced because of disaster and tragedy. But then combined with a history that we have, for lack of a better way of saying it, but I think you said it really well, which is that folks that have the means and the potential to move will always figure out the next cool place where they want to be.
That's right.
And they will find a way to eliminate whatever was there to begin with. So you talked about this huge disconnect from the people who are there, who know the place. They actually know the best way to do initial response and what recovery looks like. They know what community is and how to come together. And that has been left out of or disconnected with this bigger, quote unquote, recovery post-Katrina. So you lean in. So you are focusing on trying to bridge that gap and trying to help create and support more power and resources into community. What did that do, and how did that lead to something called Taproot Earth?
Yeah, I do lean in. This is our home. This is what you fight for. I'm grateful that I come from a culture where that is of value and that is valued. It's been an interesting journey. 20 years next year. Can you believe that? Oh my gosh. That journey started with a lot of hands-on work, grunt work, looking at the data, looking at, making the arguments, engaging with systems and people and leaders, and really saying we've got to change something. At some point, you realize you're one person, and if we want a system to change, we're either going to need a lot of money or a lot of people. And when you learn about movements and social movements, you learn there's rarely a lot of money, but the work is to get the people. I'm from South Louisiana. I know how to get people. We get people all the time. All you got to do is cook some food and call them in, and they'll come, And the truth is, and so this was an area that I felt very naturally called to. And then there's another part of that conversation that's really real. You need resources to move some of this stuff. You want things rebuilt. You want things rebuilt in a different way. You want people to be able to advocate to their leaders in D.C. You got to have some resources. And so really began that journey working with a few folks in philanthropy who just started believing in us. Not my favorite space, philanthropy. It's a lot of privilege that requires you to prove to them why some of the resources that they have access to belong back in the hands of the people. And that's, I think, really where I began telling the truth of an economic system that allows for the wealth, especially in this country, only to exist because it has taken from so many and has taken from so much. And to begin talking about philanthropy, not as charity, but as justice, how recovery isn't just in our hands, but it's in everyone's hands. How building a better place isn't just for the folks on the front line, it's for all of us who love this country and want it to be a better place. And folks who have resources have a role to play. They're not generally the most interested in following frontline leadership, or Black leadership, or poor leadership, or uneducated leadership. There's a lot of convincing that has to happen. It's not an easy conversation, but some people are ready to hear the truth. And I've been really blessed to be in places where, I've been on boards and things. People are just trying to get money to the ground and they don't know who to get it to. The networks that we have built over 20 years in Gulf South and Appalachia have me in touch with over 1,000 organizations on the ground who are reputable and can take the resources and do the right thing with them. So,
from radical seeds come radical and revolutionary roots. The main root is the taproot. Its first direction is down. It nourishes more roots that reach out, sometimes for miles, across borders, across generations. The root systems of live oaks can communicate and share water during the tidal surge of a Category 5 hurricane. The taproot of a cypress tree grows deep enough for the other roots to spread far and wide, building networks, building systems, building inspiration for a movement built on love and collective liberation. Rooted in communities on the front lines of the climate crisis. Choose now to fight for the planet and her people.
It's interesting. It harkens back to what you did when you first landed back in the region. You were the navigator into an unjust and unfair system about how to get initial recovery resources from the government to folks that don't have access, aren't the ones that the system was designed for to serve easily. And what it sounds like is you've taken the same navigational capacity into how to attract resources, to acknowledge or recognize I'm the president of an intergenerational foundation that has an endowment built on a combination of the incredible success that the market and this country and this society allowed to happen and the value created in that. And at the same time is a system that from the beginning was built unfairly on labor inequitably utilized, resources inequitably extracted. That's got to be hard on one level. You have a set of values, and this navigational role that you're playing must have you feel torn. You keep doing it, and I wonder, you've done it for a while, what feels successful in this? You are navigating and translating, and how is that going?
I think the problem at the root cause of the climate crisis is capitalism and an unjust economic system. And I know that many people will walk out the door as soon as I say something like that, like, what do you mean? I think the economic system of this country has been racialized and biased. And I think we have a value system that is rooted in extraction. And I think that's wrong. I think we should value creation. I think we should value love. I think we should have a different value system. So it's really hard, to sit in these rooms with people who are trying to figure out what to do with $30 million or how to get asking questions of whether or not the ground can handle a $200,000 grant because they don't really know how to handle money. And, you have to hear this stuff. And people say it right to your face, as though the conditions that people live in and the realities that people live in are of their creation. And that is just not the case. It is hard to receive the ignorance around wealth and privilege. And I try to extend what I understand to be grace, because it's not going to help if nobody changes. And it has been successful. I've talked to many folks who run foundations, family funds, people who see and try to understand their money and want to do something better with it as the next generation goes on and comes up. And I consider that an honor. What's been successful is we've been able to create community-controlled funds where we have created a system of governance that the people control, including how to distribute the dollars that come in. And my job is often then to convince those folks with dollars, like, put it over there. And then they say, well, what is it going to go to, Colette? What is it going to do? What are the deliverables? And I say, I don't know, and I can't tell you. Here's what I know. The decision will be collective, and the community will agree on it. And that is what I am hoping for as an organizer, to see more people practice democracy and collective decision-making rooted in values that we all agree to. It's been successful. We started our first one at the 10 year of Katrina. We've done many since then. And now we're on to a global one called a Reef Fund. And that global fund will be governed by people from around the world to not just get money to the front lines for a new climate reality, but to give an alternative to the IMF, to the World Bank, who put these countries in debt to a point of not being able to be ready or able to deal with climate change. This isn't just about the money. It's about how we build our world in a different way. And that part has been successful.
I wonder if you can go into some more detail about what you have seen that is inspiring to you on how resources have been used to address the fundamental disconnect that you saw in New Orleans when you came back between individuals and community and people who know the land and know the history and know the culture and know how to get stuff done, and these broader systems that were set up to work against them.
In addition to Katrina, 5 years later, we had the BP oil drilling disaster. Yeah. And that was really where I began to connect the dots, right? It's the extraction that is the economic driver for Louisiana and Texas, at the very least, is also the driver of this global imbalance and these global realities that look like storms and heat waves and such. There's some beautiful things that happen, but one of the things to mention here is that a lot of the fisher folk weren't able to go on the water. These are breadwinners for the family because the natural resources have been tainted or destroyed. What do you do? In the Vietnamese community, what was beautiful was a lot of the fisher folk had to start working on land, and they began a community garden that then provided food to a New Orleans restaurant scene that got the income back to the people, but it also began and established and advanced a local food economy, which is actually better for the planet. And all of a sudden, we've created a new system that could be replicated, that required resources. Folks had to be trained. Money had to go to, getting land and getting things together. There was also, they did started growing food through aquaponics. You had to invest in that and setting up those aquaponic systems, this water-based food system in a place that has plenty of water, so, how do we use these things and think about this differently? That's just one example that comes to mind around how the resources, if used differently, can actually help to address a very real reality.
You've already expanded your work. Why is Taproot expanding into Appalachia? And from that, what is different, if there is anything, in the work that you're doing in the coast relative to work in Appalachia?
Mm-hmm. So if you think about the energy system of this country that needs to transition, you get to oil, gas, and coal. And that brings us into Appalachia. And it turns out that many of the civil rights successes come out of the South. Many of the labor right successes come out of Appalachia. This is an energy system of a country that we need to shift. We actually need oil, gas, and coal to move out. You need those workers in those communities to get behind it. And so it is a natural alliance that has actually happened before to bring the Gulf South states and the Appalachian states together. These are also places rooted in deep culture. These are also places that have a particular political reality. So not the easiest place to work. But if you can make change in the Gulf South and Appalachia, you can change the country. And if you can make change in the energy system of this country, we can save the planet. And the additional expansion for Taproot is Gulf South, Appalachia, and the Black diaspora, which we define as the place where kidnapped Africans were brought into the Western economies. So Western Europe, North America, South America, Central America, Caribbean, and looking at what are the frontline realities there in a lot of these places. So our work is the Gulf South, Appalachia, and the Black diaspora. That's the African continent and the western part of the transatlantic slave trade legacy.
Thank you for that. And that commonality resonates, being a institution that is rooted in Pittsburgh and Southwest Pennsylvania and the northern tip of Appalachia, and struggling with moving through that necessary transition from a resource extractive fossil fuel economy into that economy of the future, and then a transition that includes everybody.
Right.
So we have a guest questioner. This person, like you, has some experience working through what you've talked about.
Hi, Colette. This is Lois Gibbs, and like you, I'm an environmental activist and a Heinz Award honoree. I organized the community opposition to the Love Canal toxic waste dump in Niagara Falls, New York in 1978, and I haven't stopped working since then. I greatly admire the groundbreaking work you and Taproot Earth are doing in organizing communities across the country and across the world. And my question for you is this. Environmental news can be so overwhelmingly dire, from adverse health effects from fracking or dumps like what I faced, to increasingly serious fires, to our ever-shrinking shorelines. What gives you hope and perseverance to continue your work? And what would you tell other environmental activists who are feeling overwhelmed?
Oh, wow. That was great. Thank you. Thank you, Lois, and thank you, Heinz, for, I think, creating this kind of community. You know, you get questions, but to get a question from someone who knows what you're experiencing, that was beautiful. Every time I walk in a room and have to talk about climate change, I'm like, oh, Lord, I'm going to bring the mood down. But I try to ensure that the culture that I come from, which incorporates a lot of laughter and just a lot of joy, to bring that into the work whenever I can. I do get down moments like today, hurricanes, water temperatures, these are things that make me sad and nervous and worried. But I have to say, every morning when I'm home, which is not that often, I travel a lot, but when I'm home, I take a walk and I honor the trees. And then I take a drive to the swamp where I can just look in a lot of directions and see the place that I love. It's beautiful to me. And I am every day that I'm able to do that, reminding myself of love and what I love and beauty. And then when I get to my next stop, I look for some alligators. because the alligators, for me, remind me Louisiana is very special. Look at all of the things that we have that others don't have. We have things that survive. Alligators are older than dinosaurs, and they're still here. And I say a prayer to my grandfather. I ask him to bless me on that day and to help me continue to work. And I would encourage anyone to take time to pray or meditate or just center yourself in something greater than you. We are not the only ones here, and this is not a fight that started today. To really root in respect of those trees, love of a place, honoring of my heritage and of the land that I come from. And that's what I would offer to folks. Wherever we can begin to build our own ritual of joy and love and respect and honor, I think we'll be better off for it.
That is such a lovely offering. I was going to ask you what advice you would give to folks right now who are in the middle of response and then recovery. But I think you just did. So what I'll do is close as we always do. The name of our podcast is We Can Be. What do you believe we, the collective we, can be?
We can be leaders of a new and beautiful and better world. We can be courageous. We can be loving. And we can be a community.
Well, Colette, thank you for sharing your leadership, your vision, your drive, your commitment to being a part of that world with us today. We are grateful. We're honored to have been able to play a part in supporting your work and wish you all the best and hope our paths cross again.